So the in the last video, I mentioned several times this new style that Michelangelo seems to be um, headed in with the projects he does at San Lorenzo. And I didn't give a name to that style, though some would call that style Mannerist. The movement, if there is one, of Mannerism is something that's discussed by art historians. People take different stands on whether we should give it such a name, if something different really does happen. I think in your textbook they kind of avoid it altogether. Um, and it's hard for me to say exactly how to define it. What I can say is that it is clear that at the Medici Chapel, Michelangelo is doing things differently. He's pushing the limits and even breaking some of the rules about composition and architecture and, you know, doing something, sorry, clearly different with the figures, making them extra twisty and imbalanced, and things are different, right? Um, the way I was taught, we label that style that he's demonstrating there and the style of the artists that are working in that same kind of style, which emerges in Florence as Michelangelo is working on those projects at San Lorenzo, and really he's the source of this new style, as Mannerism. So just know, I guess, that not everyone identifies it as a style or as a movement, but that I see it as a stylistic tendency that is pretty specific to Florence and that emerges as a new way of the appearance of art. And it happens, during this particular moment in the history of the city, as the city is being ruled over by these de facto rulers of the Medici popes, and then eventually with their official successor, the first Duke of Florence, who we'll talk about very shortly. In any case, one of the artists in painting that we see working in this new style is the artist Jacopo Pontormo. And this is an altarpiece, the so-called Vistomini altarpiece. It's in the Church of San Michele in Vistomini in Florence, commissioned by the Pucci family. And here, I think you get a sense of some of those strange inclusions, or stylistic inclusions that are different than what we've seen so far as we've looked at a high Renaissance painting. Keep in your mind, say, Raphael's Madonna of the Prato, as kind of the poster child of what high Renaissance style looks like. So if you think about that, then you can see here that Pontormo is using a different, he likes these kind of odd, cold colors. Some of the figures are strange in the way that, their facial expressions, or in the way that they're positioned, that there doesn't seem to really be a cohesive system of perspective. There's not much space at all. In fact, everything's kind of mashed up to the foreground. You've got the Virgin here, Joseph, the Christ child, and then they are all flanked by saints. So all of that's quite standard. It's just the way that they're represented. You have these elongated figures with these tiny little heads. The system of proportions is different here than what we've seen as being important to high Renaissance artists. And it's not the same kind of idealization. And I mean, I guess one of the main things that I think you can say about Mannerism is that while those high Renaissance artists were so focused on the study of nature and then improving upon nature to achieve this kind of ideal state, In mannerism, it's not about the study of nature at all. It's all artificial in that what they are looking at are the works by Michelangelo, or they're just conceiving that these compositions and figures out of their ideas, out of their heads, without the study of the female or male body. They're certainly not doing dissections or studying natural phenomena. It's not about nature anymore. I think these ideas will come clear to you as you see this altarpiece. This is the entombment or deposition. It's hard to say exactly which moment is shown here, whether it's when Christ has been lifted off of the cross or when they are depositing his body in the tomb, because there's really no setting here. There's some sense of the ground, and there's a little puff cloud in the background to give you the sense of the sky. But everything, all these figures are so mashed up to the foreground that there's no sense of setting. The color scheme that Pontormo has used here is so high-pitched, really bright, contrasting colors, colors that are not meant to be harmonic. They're not like Raphael's colors. They are not colors that you would easily find in nature. Again, they're moving away from that replication or idealization of nature and doing something totally different. Certainly in this altarpiece, you see the elongated figures in these tiny little heads, so the proportional relationships of the body are different here. You've got these figures that are in really difficult positions, not positions they could easily hold. You see this guy is just on his very, very tippy toes. So it's not like in the High Renaissance where they would want to show something that could really happen, like the way people naturally stand. This is all really contrived, right? And again, with that idea of no sense of setting, there's no sense of spatial relations here. It's hard to tell really where the Virgin is in relation to the body of Christ. She looks gigantic. We don't know what she's on, if she's seated on something, if something's carrying her. It's very difficult to make any sense out of. This I show you just so you can see how it appears in its chapel. This is in the Church of San Felice, and sorry, not San Felice, in Santa Felicita. And it is right on the other side of the Ponte Vecchio, on the other side away from the Palazzo Vecchio. So Pontormo did the altarpiece and frescoes on one of the walls, and he and his assistants did these roundels above. But here we get a better look at the painting. So you've got these small figures that we assume are meant to be understood as being in the background, but they're elevated, so it's kind of hard to tell. It's sort of like they're standing on bleachers. It's all very strange, difficult to read. You've got this little head poking out from the background. He's quite sweet. This is, in fact, a self-portrait of Pontormo. But if you just take a few minutes and just look at the various areas in here that are odd, look at the lighting and the different colors that light causes on these two legs. Or this crouching figure, does he have on a pink shirt that turns blue? There's this yellow fabric that turns orange, green that turns into a deeper green. We see that going through. And if you remember, when we were looking at the Sistine Chapel ceiling, I mentioned to you the idea of colore cangiante that Michelangelo uses, those changing colors. And certainly that is the influence here. And in the way that the bodies have been shown here, it seems to reflect a knowledge of the figures that Michelangelo was doing in the new sacristy, and it's very likely that Pontormo would have seen those figures firsthand and perhaps takes them as some sort of source of inspiration. And in fact, I think you can see some of those connections as you look at these two images for comparison. This sort of packed nature of the composition is very much like the packed composition in the chapel, that these figures are so compressed into their spaces, particularly these seated figures. You know, it's not space that makes sense. It's not meant to be like what you would see in the natural world. They're doing something very different here. That twisted nature of the figures, you know, you certainly see it in the figure of Christ and this guy down here. You know, you've got people moving, all of these figures are moving in different directions. That kind of variety is something that they really start to value in these compositions by the Mannerist and their students. You could make an interesting comparison, in fact, between the architectural elements in the Medici chapel and the elements in Pontormo's altarpiece. Just thinking about functionality and how they're both kind of a denial of what the function is. Altarpieces were supposed to be easy to read, serve as the kind, you know, as a way of communicating the stories of the Bible or major beliefs of the church to the worshiper. But this is so hard to understand. The average viewer may not even recognize what exactly it is. And in fact, as I mentioned, we're not sure exactly what this moment is supposed to represent. So that kind of intentional, you know, lack of clarity is something that is present in both of these. The idea really is that making this an intellectual, it makes art a sort of intellectual game, and that you would need to know the rules to understand what rules have been broken, and from there think about why the artist has chosen to do it and what all the elements are and what the meaning behind the painting is and what symbols are there and what the story is and all of that sort of thing. So this is a real culmination of that rise of the status of the artist, because now art itself, the products of art, are being looked at as a real demonstration of not only the artist's skill, but also of his intellect. And it also demands a certain level of what we would call connoisseurship, a certain familiarity with art to understand what the artist has done here. And it's no longer about art being instructive for the masses. This is much more geared for an elite audience. Another artist that works in this style in Florence is Rosso Fiorentino. And Rosso Fiorentino is actually his nickname. It means the red Florentine because he had famously fiery red hair. He works in Florence for a while, but he also works in France at the court of Francis I and does a number of important works there, along with some other Italians. But what I want to show you here is this really striking contrast between Raphael's crucifixion from 1502 and Rosso Fiorentino's composition here. And what I'll ask you to do is, in your quiz for this lecture, I'll have a question that will ask you to compare these two paintings and think about what elements you can see as being different in Rosso's treatment of the figure, of the composition, of the subject matter, of the overall how the whole painting works together, and try to work through some of those ideas. Another painting by Rosso Fiorentino that shows his Mannerist style is this one, The Dead Christ with Angels. And I always like to show this one because if you're in the New England region, this painting is not far away from us. It's at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Well, I hope that just right off the bat you could see some of the kind of odd elements of this that really define what mannerism is all about. Again, you have everything pushed up to the foreground. There's little sense of space or of setting. You've got figures that are just kind of odd. You've got this gigantic figure of Christ who is turned and looks like, I don't know what he's seated on. There's no way he's actually sitting down and able, I don't know, to have his feet resting in this way. It looks like all of the weight of his body is being carried on his toes. It's not a realistic depiction of how the body sits and appears when it's in a seated position. We see the Christ as being the dead Christ, and presumably in some way supported by these angels. Though, as you can see, they are mere, the only thing they're doing really is pointing out the wound of Christ here on his side, one of the wounds he received as part of the Passion cycle while he was on the cross. He's speared in the side, and that it leaves that mark behind. But needless to say, one of the really weird elements of this is that we have the male body of Christ, but he evidently has his genitals tucked between his legs because they're not visible here. Certainly, it would not have been shocking to see the genitals of Christ. It happened in crucifixions, in other types of paintings, you would see it. And, in sculptures even, you see the nude Christ. And sometimes there would be a cloth that maybe they would drape over the figure's genitals at certain times of the year or whatever. But the nudity of Christ was really seen as proof that Christ was human. It showed his actual, that he had the flesh of a real human. So, that's why you often see, I don't know, in paintings of the Virgin and Child, some like in the Bellini ones that we saw, you'll see the genitals of the Christ child, and the Virgin will be gesturing towards the genitals so that you notice them. And that's really to emphasize this human quality of Christ, his divinity, of course, but to emphasize that human quality helped make Christ and his suffering and his miraculous resurrection all the more compelling for the worshiper in the Renaissance. So that's an odd bit not to see his genitals here, and it really makes the Christ figure appear completely androgynous, right? And androgyny is definitely a quality that we see emerge with mannerism. The angels are similarly androgynous, though angels often would be shown as being half male and half female, as androgyny was seen as the ideal state of existence, having both halves of the possible sexes in one being. So that's kind of an odd bit of this. So I think this has, you've got all these bright contrasting colors and so forth. It's got all of the characteristics one would look for in Mannerist painting. All right,